How are you? Hope you're having a great, cozy winter so far and getting ready for the holidays. What's been happening here? I'm all kind of busted up. I'm still recovering from Thanksgiving. I kind of burned myself on the pan that was holding the turkey. I just kind of singed my skin, but it's healing pretty nicely, but it looks kind of nasty. I also, last night, we had our holiday party at work, and I hit my knuckles trying to help out and putting some ice in one of the bins that hold like wine and beer and all that. And I just kept banging my knuckles against the side of the cooler. And I'm like, oh man, I have two like nasty little bruises there. So, but all part of it. And here we are 2 weeks before Christmas, before the holidays. I can't even believe it. This is Lisa from Life with Fife, in case you don't know me. This is a podcast where we talk about knitting and creativity and spirituality and how those intersect. We also talk about, one of our favorite topics here is Elizabeth Zimmerman, who, in my opinion, is an amazing mentor for us as knitters. She brought this sense of independence to knitting. She freed knitters from the dictates of patterns that were written by the commercial knitting industry, which was very heavily invested in patterns that were based in dressmaking principles. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but Elizabeth did not feel that was useful, and for a number of reasons. And so therefore, the entire knitting industry as we know it today, as a community of craftspeople coming together and sharing patterns, the economic interplay that happens in that community, and actually gives many knitters and designers the opportunity for certain economic people can actually make money from their knitting in a way that is free of having to be employed by some larger commercial knitting corporation. She did that. That was her entire, she transformed everything. And I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to just say that everything that we have today, from Ravelry, from the rise of the independent designer, to the vast diversity of knitting patterns that we can choose from, all of that is because of Elizabeth. She is the first one to have opened the door in that way, and we have her to thank for that. So today's episode is going to be about Elizabeth. So, get cozy, get a cup of tea or coffee or wine, whatever it is that your beverage of choice, and settle in with your knitting. And let's talk about Elizabeth, the amazing Elizabeth Zimmerman. So Elizabeth was, she brought to her knitting a really unique background, because she was raised in a family kind of at the change, the Victorian times into late industrial, and her family had money, but it was not working out. She was her family was losing money, and so Elizabeth had this experience of being sent to boarding schools, having a certain number of servants in the home, and then seeing that kind of slip away. She was able, because her mother went out and joined the workplace and created kind of the original Meals on Wheels. Basically delivered, it was a home delivery of meals. And she was quite successful, and she was quite remarkable for her time for doing this. But from Elizabeth's perspective, this was a challenging time. It was an embarrassing experience for her. She was living in this upper class kind of surrounded boarding school community where everybody kind of had a different life at home than she did. And she talks about her embarrassment of her parents. And I think that this feeling in particular towards her mother really will inform her entire life, and is actually really kind of critical to her later development as a knitter. Her parents, she was raised to knit. Her family was not a happy one, however. She talks about her mother being, I don't know, stern, kind of. There was a lot of just unhappiness in the home, unhappiness perhaps between the parents because of the father's lack of income, perhaps. And Elizabeth perhaps viewed the unhappiness in her home. She equated the unhappiness in her home to the fact that her mother left the home and kind of left her role as housewife and went out into the world to make the needed money that had to be in order to support Elizabeth in her lifestyle. So, and later on, Elizabeth does talk about her mother as being sort of remarkable in a sense that she was able to create that life for her family. But there's always this tension between her and her mother about the role as a housewife and the unhappiness in the home and the fact that her mother left the home to do this. I mean, she was still coming home at night, but it was like leaving this role of housewife. And that Elizabeth, in her later life talked about that she always viewed herself as a professional housewife, that she kind of created this new way of being a woman in the world that did not denigrate housework, that did not leave the home, but that somehow found a place within the home to make your professional life. And it's quite remarkable that she did that as well, because she expanded upon the idea of what was possible for women. At the time she was, I can imagine, I mean, I can't speak for Elizabeth, but I can imagine at the time she might have felt out of step, especially in the 60s and the 70s as things started to change. So while this was all happening, Elizabeth also had a tension between what she saw. So she was raised as a knitter in England and in Germany, where she was taught very different skill sets, and she really learned to be a skilled knitter from both of these environments. And then she came to America, where it was, she said, pitiful, that there was just no yarns that were decent. There was, women just only knitted dressmaking patterns, and that was it. That was all that was left that was all there was. And she just felt that it was really pitiful, and that there was a dearth that was left. There was also, this was the simultaneous rise in the 1950s of what we call today fast fashion. So there was, suddenly where Elizabeth had grown up with this idea of knitting as a practical thing for a family member, a mother to do, for a family to do, because clothes were not readily available. That if you wanted nice clothes, you had to make them. And so knitting was a practical skill in the home. But now with the rise of, in America, with the rise of fast fashion, there was no real need for knitting any longer. And then it became, and knitters who wanted to knit were kind of doing it for the love of knitting, and as a, kind of for the hobby of knitting, and Elizabeth, she saw that the knitting industry sort of was neglecting these knitters. There was a group, there were still knitters who wanted to knit out of the love of knitting, not necessarily for the practicality of knitting, and who also wanted to use good fibers, natural fibers like wool. Really, wool was the only alternative to acrylics. And she saw this opportunity, and at the same time, she was, as a designer, as someone who was looking to put her patterns out there, she was in conflict with the commercial knitting industry, because she would submit their patterns, she would be accepted to be in their magazines, and they would change her patterns into dressmaking patterns, where it was knit flat, and that was not how she wanted it to be. So she became very frustrated with this idea. And also, this idea, which I think is, to me, it's very, very interesting, because I look at Elizabeth and I think, how could a woman like her how could she have been anti-feminist, which she literally says that she's a masculinist. I mean, she literally comes out and says that she's opposed to feminism. And so I've really been thinking about it, because she was a feminist in today's way of thinking about feminism, right? She was an independent woman, so she didn't need to fight for her rights per se. However, from her perspective, feminism, look how they viewed the role of women in the home. It was kind of where we have, the Victorian times where women's work was, it was women's work, but there was a reverence to it. There was a, for good or ill, right? There was a reverence about that. All of a sudden, feminism came along, and especially in the 60s and the 70s, and they talked about women's work as being unpaid work. There was a resistance from women to do that because women wanted to go out into the workplace and women wanted to have it all, right? That was the time when we could have everything. And Elizabeth, I would imagine, as someone who could remember, and this is where I say her connection with her mother and her mother's moving out into the world and the tension that brought the family and her perception of what created an unhappy home. Here again was Elizabeth kind of playing with this dynamic in the larger culture. And not only did it perhaps offend her sensibilities, I don't know if it offended her sensibilities, I can't speak for her, but I know that it fed into the commercial knitting industry, creating fewer and fewer patterns that empowered the knitter and kind of were based on this fast fashion, using inexpensive wools, and probably because fewer women of a certain age wanted to knit anymore, they were out doing other things. Knitting became kind of something that maybe seemed out of step. So Elizabeth viewed perhaps feminism, I mean, I'm guessing here, I'm interpreting, I have no idea, I'm not speaking for Elizabeth. I can imagine though that she saw feminists or the feminist movement as rejecting everything that she held dear to her heart. And so I can understand from that perspective that she rejected their principles and instead always held true to her role as professional housewife, which really is a legitimate way for women to find power both in the home and in the workplace. So it's actually in line with all feminist principles, but at the time there was probably it was more black and white. And so Elizabeth perhaps felt the need to distance herself from that. And so Elizabeth in the 1950s started to create her newsletters and create this community of knitters who will come together, read her newsletters, rather than the commercial knitting industry acting as, the great father who sends out the patterns and this is only one place to get them, and these are and here's the yarn that you need to buy, and this is what you do, and it's always done in this way that we dictate. Elizabeth suddenly created a community of knitters. It was a knitter-to-knitter community where she wrote out her newsletters, sharing stories from her home life, and also including a pattern, and selling yarn, selling really good quality wool yarn that had not been available to the American markets before that. So she found her niche and she connected with that niche. But this idea of knitters having a community together and creating an economy based on that community, this was radical for the time, and this is actually where we get our Ravelry and the communities that we have today. I would argue that if it were not for Elizabeth, we would not have any of these things. She created the model of this knitter-to-knitter community. So so that's what I'm talking about today with Elizabeth. She was amazing. She was truly a revolutionary, and we owe her so much. And there's still so much to say, but there's my little piece about her today and how she helped to create the knitting world that we know it today. So I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season. Hope you're going to stay warm. If you like what you hear here at this channel, please subscribe, so that you can be notified, and hit notifications so that you can be notified of when I post a new video. If you have any comments about today and have any information about Elizabeth, I'd love to hear that, because I just love her so much and I love to hear things about her life that I don't know. yeah, so have an amazing rest of your weekend. Namaste.